Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you are all okay, and thank you very much for joining today. First off, I do recognise a few names, but if people don't know me, my name is Michael Graham, and I'm a Senior Project Manager for Trueman Change, and I will be hosting today's Change Chat. So officially, just want to say welcome to our October 2024 edition of the Change Chat. For anyone that hasn't been to these before, the way that they work is that we pick a particular topic, we pull together a panel, and then we provide you with tips and expertise on that topic. We want and we like these sessions to be really informal, and we do try and make them as interactive as possible. This Change Chat today is going to be a little bit different compared with some of the other ones that we've done, as is Lucy is going to share some slides, as you will see, that are already on the screen. So if you do have any questions throughout, though, please either wait until the end, where there'll be some time designated for questions, or pop them in the chat as you think of them, and I will come to them at the end of the session. So what you may have noticed is that we do record these sessions, and everybody who is booked onto the session will receive a copy of the recording. So if for any reason you have to unexpectedly leave, or you want to share this with anybody, please do so. In addition, the recording will also be available on our YouTube page and on our social media channels. So as I've said, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and I will come to them at the end, where we will designate some question time at the end. So today's session is on change management tools, or tools for change. And I am delighted to say that we are joined by the founder and managing director of Trueman Change, Lucy Trueman. So thank you very much for joining us. And I just wondered if you'd like to introduce yourself to attendees before we move into the main body of the Change Chat.
Hi everyone, so I'm Lucy. I am a project and change manager by trade and an organisational psychologist by academic background. I specialise in change management in the public sector, and I'm just going to share, we don't normally do this, so we normally have like just an informal chat, but because this was particularly about models and tools, I thought it would be useful to share some slides with you with some diagrams on of what some of these models and tools look like. So hopefully it's not too boring, because I feel like we don't normally do it this formally.
It'd be lessons for us, depending on how it goes. So just before we start, can you explain why you've chosen tools for change as today's Change Chat topic?
Yeah, so a lot of conversations I have with people when I'm working in the public sector is about what are the popular tools and techniques and methodologies. There's a lot of debate about different ones, and interestingly, there is a lot of difference in opinion about different ones. When I look at it from a more academic background and actually looking at it from a psychology background, that adds another layer of nuance in terms of why certain tools have become more popular than others, and it's not necessarily because there's evidence backing them up. So I thought it would be a good idea to just share some of the popular tools and apply a bit of critical thinking around them, really. So I'm not particularly promoting any of these tools, and I think that there is something about making sure that you have access to a range of things, and that you can kind of pick and choose when the time is right. But yeah, as I said, we don't normally do our change chats, are normally literally just a chat, so this is a little bit more of a lesson. So do tell me if it's a bit boring and you don't want us to, you want to go back to the old format. That's absolutely fine. It's just an experiment.
Great stuff. Well, I'll hand over to Lucy in a second, and as I know a few people have just joined while we were talking, so just to reiterate, if you do have any questions, if you could wait until the end or pop them in the chat, and I will come to them at the end and relay them back to Lucy. So over to you, Lucy.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. So as I've said, we're going to run through a bit of a history of change management as a discipline, some popular tools, and then we're going to have a look at those through a bit more of a critical lens, and also bring some of that psychology stuff in as well. So this isn't, it's well suited to people that are going through change at the moment, that are leading change, that have got a bit of experience in change management or an interest in it. Please don't be offended if I say anything about your favorite tool, that it's your favorite tool and you live and die by it. That's absolutely fine. I just want to kind of give a bit of a rounded view, because there's quite a lot of stuff out there. So First of all, and my specialism is local government. It doesn't particularly matter that, and if you're not from local government, it's fine. But I thought it would be interesting to just reflect on the history of change management and how we do change in that particular sector, because that's what I know. I imagine it is pretty consistent with other sectors as well. So a lot of change has been dominated by project and program management discipline. And I think where that comes from is a desire for change to be a little bit more predictable and controlled. So what we tend to do is we tend to use tools that were actually designed by engineers for engineering projects in more people change related ways. So you see this with PRINCE2, which stands for projects in a controlled environment. You see it with Agile, which is very IT in its background. Now, that's not to say that those tools and techniques can't give us something that's worth learning, but it is worth bearing in mind that they weren't actually designed with change in mind. They were designed with building bridges in mind. And actually, that is an area where you want a lot to be very specific and predictable and planned. It's not really the case when you're doing change on how people think and how people work. So we've got that whole influence. So what else have we got? We then realised that that was lacking. The people side of change is a phrase that is often used a lot. So change management as a discipline then came up as almost a complementary discipline to project management. And it's worth saying that that came from, in the majority, consultants. So some of the stuff that I'll share with you were designed by consultants. Now, I'm allowed to moan about consultants because I am one. What consultants love is to simplify something so that they can scale it up and sell it. So there is a risk that we are basing a lot of our discipline and our profession on stuff that was designed to sell rather than necessarily to design to change. So I'm not intending to be hypercritical, because I think that both of these professions definitely bring something to the table, but it is worth being aware of what the drivers of how some of these tools were developed is, so that when we are being critical about when they're right to use and when they're not, and in my opinion, some of the change management tools and methodologies do oversimplify the process for sure. So certainly in local government, which if you're not in local government is quite a complex sector, we fell in love a bit with PMOs. Now, PMOs are the Project Management Office, which is usually a central resource, which is about, oh my goodness, there's all this change going on. It's all a bit chaotic. How do we control that? And how do we get an organisational wide view? And that is a really positive thing. So being able to understand what direction your organization is going in and how much change is happening is absolutely very positive. They, in practice, vary on a bit of a spectrum of where they are facilitating that change and being really supportive to it, but also can sometimes swing into more of a gatekeeping role where they're gatekeeping change and they're gatekeeping resource. And I'm sure many of you on the call will have worked with PMOs at different points in that spectrum. I think as well, then, we're starting now more recently to think about change leadership as a skill. So what the three boxes up until now have in common is they are professions and disciplines in their own right, which can be important because it's worth having people who know and understand change, but also there can be a risk that you're disempowering the business and the service leaders to be able to drive change. And I do think that we are going to start to think more carefully about the skill of our leaders to lead change rather than the process of change and how we resource that. And I think the other thing I just wanted to throw in there is, again, this is very common across the public sector. My background is local government. Over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say the majority of change that has happened has been driven by austerity and the need to make savings or to do more with less. And that is worth pointing out because that creates a certain mindset in change, and it's a difficult narrative. Social workers do not become a social worker because they want to save money. They become a social worker because they want to help people. So we've got this kind of mixing pot of how we do change that is driven by these different disciplines who, to varying degrees, were not founded for the reasons that we're using them. And then we've got this complex kind of way of doing change that is often against the very values values of which our people have come into their role to do. So it isn't easy. This is not an easy picture. And then, of course, you add to that, we've got changes in politics. We've got a fairly new and recent government. We've got societal change. We're having to deal with increased demand in a lot of areas. We've had to be extremely responsive. So if you think about the change we did during the pandemic and how that's quite different from the change we were doing maybe 20 years ago. And we've got this kind of funding model, which may change with the new government. I don't really know. But where we're often having to just bid for money to get access to money quickly, and it doesn't really help us with this long-term way of thinking. So I feel it's a bit of a miserable start, but it's important to know that context, because actually we are always going to have to do change. We're always going to have to deal with change. But one of the fundamental questions I would like you to consider as we go through this session is it always possible to plan change? Because a lot of the models that we use are based on the assumption that change is sequential and we can plan it. So that's something that it's worth holding in your mind, because if that is the case, that it's not always possible to plan it, that kind of turns some of our tools on their head. So popular change management models. So I'm going to fly through this really quickly. You may have heard of them, you may have not heard of all of them. I'm starting strong with the change curve, which is one that is popular in that it is used a lot. It is worth, though, considering that this never came from studies in change. It came from studies in grief. This is also the grief curve. So there's some questions to be asked there as to why we felt that that is correct and appropriate to apply those same emotions to going through change. I think it's useful as a model in that it encourages you to consider that there is an emotional impact for change. However, I do not believe it happens in this order. I think this is probably more like what the change curve actually looks like in real practice in terms of people's emotions being all over the place. So I don't think that we go through it in order. I think we dance about it, and I think different people will go through different points at different times, and different people will be more sensitive to change. We know in psychology that people's sensitivity to change varies. We know that their sensitivity to risk varies. So I think there's a slight danger. There's a good message in that, there's going to be an emotional impact to change. That's a positive thing for leaders to be aware of. To think that it's this predictable, I think, is oversimplifying and a little bit dangerous. So next one I was going to share with you is the 3-stage model by Lewin. So this was from the 50s, and this model is basically about a period of unfreezing, a period of change, and a period of refreezing. So again, what you'll see here is this concept of that something is sequential, which is why I planted that seed at the start. Is it sequential? Is it predictable? Because a lot of our models are based on the assumption that it is. But basically with this model, you would think about what the current situation is. You'd go through that period of like unfreezing it, examining it, creating that future vision. And one of the tools that is combined with this is this kind of force field analysis, where you start to look at what drives change and what is resisting change, which again, I think in its own right is a useful model to think about. So then you would go through the change where you'd implement that, and then the refreeze bit, which I think a lot of organizations do sort of forget. We focus on the change, but this concept of embedding that consistency and making sure that we're keeping going with the change, I think is really important. So that one is Lewin's model from 1951. This one is more recent. This is a transitions model by Bridges, which is actually similar. What I do like about this model is that it considers endings. And again, that's an area I do see organizations neglect a little bit. So what this is about is it's being clear on what needs to change, but respecting that history. And you see this a lot when you get a new leader. So a new leader will come into an organization, they'll say, this is all rubbish and it needs to change. And they don't necessarily respect that history. They don't give people the time to come to terms with, we are now ending this. And we launch straight into this neutral zone, which is this very disorientating feel of, you're living out of a suitcase, you don't know what the change is, we're not sure where we're going. And then ultimately into that new beginnings. If you don't do that endings bit right, you will see an increase in resistance, because it's quite normal that we need to go through that process. So I think there is some use to this. What Bridges believe people need in order to move through this well is they need that sense of purpose for the change. They need a picture as to what the future looks like. They need to be able to plan it, and they need to be able to play their part, which I think is common wisdom in a lot of change management methodologies, that sort of engagement and the ability to take part in it. So not a bad one by any stretch. I do like it. I don't necessarily use it on a practical basis, but I think the message of don't forget to let go of the endings and be clear on what you're stopping doing, I think is quite a powerful message. So next one, very popular one, Kotter's 8-step model. Kotter was absolutely a consultant and not an academic. And this again is that step-by-step approach. So there's the increased urgency, which some people call the burning platform. You've then got to build a team, develop your vision, communicate for the buy-in, focus on action, which is very important, short-term wins, don't let up. So that's about your perseverance, and then making change stick. So again, at face value, don't really disagree with any of it. Breaks it down into those steps. But again, are we following this assumption that it's predictable and that we will go through something in a consistent way in different organizations and different change programs? And finally, this is a very popular model by Prosky, who I think are Microsoft's change partner. So this model is, again, there's a sequential vibe to it, but it does focus a little bit more on kind of psychological stuff, which I think is a positive thing. So it's build that awareness for change, create that desire, make sure people know how to change, they have that ability, and then reinforcement to sustain the change. So you can see that that's been a common theme in a few of them, that make sure that we've got that sticking power, that reinforcement, we're embedding it. So that's a really quick run through. What I want to do now is just share with you a little bit of research about change, because as I said, most of those models are fairly simplified models designed by consultants and commercial people. So if we were to look at the psychology of change, what does that tell us? And there was a really interesting piece of research done in 2018 by Stoughton et al. And they looked at, so with change management, how do we look for where the evidence is as to what works in this world where there's lots of different models at play? And they said that the challenges were that the science, when you look at the evidence, lacks a bit of consensus. And that's partly because the research around change is coming from multiple fields. And what science tends to do is it creates a field and it narrows down, narrows down, narrows down, narrows down. So change management is a bit of leadership, a bit of HR, a bit of like kind of getting stuff done, a bit of motivation. So it's difficult. There's not a sort of holistic picture in research around change management, which is difficult. But they also acknowledge that it's quite difficult to learn from experience, because sometimes a change program is very quick. Sometimes a change program, it's years before you really do see the light at the end of the tunnel. And also it's highly, highly contextual. So what process for change may work in one organization may fall completely flat in another. So it is quite a difficult area to research. But the approach they took, I think, was quite interesting. So what they did was they made a list of popular change management models. Some of these we've just looked at, some of them we haven't. They looked at those and they looked for consistency between them and evidence that supports their statements. So what they found was, when you look at them all, and in the paper itself, there is like a table where it explains what each of them is and what evidence they've drawn on from other areas of psychology. What, if you did a sort of academic focused approach to change, would that look like? And this is what they found. So they basically came up with 10 things that a good evidence-based approach to change would need. So the first step is get your facts relating to the problem. So make sure you understand what it is that you're trying to change and what you're trying to fix. Then you would assess and address the organization's readiness for change. So that's where some of that culture would come in terms of understanding, are they able to do this change? Are they able to make it happen? Implement evidence-based change interventions. So figure out what your interventions are, make sure they're evidence-based, and start implementing them. Change leadership is really important, which is interesting because on my first slide where I touched on that, you know, we've got this kind of culture of business as usual leadership. Actually, change leadership might be a different thing. It might be a different mindset. You need to develop and communicate a compelling change vision, work with social networks. So things like change champions do work. They are supported, obviously depending on how you implement them, but there is some evidence to suggest that that kind of grassroots network of people that are making change happen does work. Use enabling practices to support the implementation. So this is your engagement stuff. So you kind of goal setting, your engagement, your participation, but also bringing in other aspects of psychology. So things like fairness really play a part here. And you will have seen if you've gone through any sort of HR, you know, restructures, the consultation period is so important because that's where some of the fairness issues do come out. And making sure that you've got those transitional arrangements in place. So that's about supporting that implementation. They then talk about microprocesses and experimentation. Assess your change progress and outcomes over time, and institutionalize the change is the word that they use, but that is back to, again, that kind of embed it and make sure that it sticks, that making sure your change is sticking. So that if you can get hold of it, it's an interesting paper, and it dances between the world of practical change management and the world of academics and psychology quite nicely, and it does give that critical eye. And I think really what I take from that paper is almost it doesn't matter which model you pick, just make sure that these components, we know there is some evidence to support them. That said, I do think that all of the models that they picked in that paper carry that underlying assumption that change is rational, it's predictable, it's a journey that can be predicted or planned. I'm not sure that that's the case. And the other thing that all change management models have in common is that change is something that people will resist. And a lot of these models are designed fundamentally to predict what will happen in what order and to reduce the resistance to change. I think it's worth exploring whether those underlying assumptions are correct in every case. If you won the lottery, we wouldn't talk about you resisting change, even though it would be a big change in your life. So why do we hold this as a truth that people will always resist change? And I think it's a dangerous truth to hold. It's worth, you know, I think there is an argument that there's an emotional impact to change and that different people can tolerate it better or worse than others. But in reality, if we educate an entire generation of change managers that resistance is normal, do we stop listening to that resistance? Because sometimes people are resisting it because it's not a very good idea. So I think that it's worth reflecting on these underlying assumptions. And I wanted to share with you a book that I covered in my master's, which explores the fact that change as a philosophy, assuming that everything is rational, is just one philosophy. This is the book. You can get it on Amazon. It is an academic book, so it is a bit dry, but it explores other philosophies. So out of the 12 chapters in the book, only one is about these kind of programmatic step-by-step approaches to change. We can also look at change through different philosophies. We can look at it through a cultural philosophy. We can look at it through an institutional philosophy, which is where change is driven by a sense of conformity. We can look at it through a political, we can look at it through a psychological, and the one that I'm particularly interested in is looking at it through a dualities project perspective, which I will come back to. So if you're a change manager and you're used to sort of books like this one here, which is a good book, you know, the Change Manager's Handbook is a good book for everything we've talked about up until now, giving you a really good range of different tools that you can apply very practically. If you feel comfortable with that, but you're ready to stretch your thinking a little bit, this is a good place to start, because it's where it starts to stretch your mind on the, actually, are we getting this right? Is it all predictable? Should it all be done in a specific order? So what's next for change? So this is my predictions of what's next for change management as a discipline. So I think the way we do change is changing. So I have done quite a bit of research. I've got a book coming out hopefully later this year, although editing a book is awful and it's taking me longer and longer. Writing it was easy, editing it is awful. But I've done a lot of research around how change happened during the pandemic. And one of the main findings from this was that these step-by-step sequential approaches went out the window. We did not pick up a Prince 2 manual during the pandemic. So what we moved towards was a balancing of tensions and in some cases, spinning of plates. So we stopped trying to predict everything and we started just trying to navigate complexities. And I think there's a huge amount of learning there. And I think that's where change management will go. So what does that look like? So in terms of the research around the tensions, so the stuff that came out of my interviews with people, the different tensions that are at play when you're managing change is how fast do you go? So again, these sequential approaches assume there is an order, but in real life and in practical situations, you have to decide that order and you have to decide that pace. And sometimes, even in the same organization, in the same change program, you may choose to go fast and other times you may choose to go slow. So again, this is moving us away from there's a specific order. You might go fast with some things and slow for others, and that's okay. It's about making a conscious decision. Planning in sometimes, again, even in the same program, in the same organization, there will be times when you need to be very planned in your approach, and there will be times when you need to be very responsive. Governance. So loads came out in my research about governance because governance was thrown up in the air during the pandemic. So in some cases, quite legally, it was, we can't have cabinet meetings and so on and so forth. But actually, there was a critical eye applied to governance, and people described this concept of where does governance need to be very tight? Where does it need to be loose? So again, this managing those tensions and making conscious decisions at different times was really important. Leadership, and whether that needs to be directive or co-produced and co-designed. So really brilliant examples of this in the pandemic. Directive leadership, everybody's got to work from home by Monday. Co-designed leadership, we've got to get food parcels out to people that need it. How are we going to do it? Everybody mucked in and figured it out. So again, where are you on that spectrum when you're going through a change of where do you need to be directive and where do you need to be co-producing? And finally, driver. What drives your change? Is it about people or is it about process? Sometimes it will be people and sometimes it will be process. And I think that as we move forward, we will start to think of change as a navigation of these tensions rather than a predictable journey. That's not to say that some elements of those predictable journeys are important and some of those lessons are important. Things like make sure it sticks, make sure you're engaging with people. But I think it will become more of a skill around spotting where you need to be on these spectrums. Now, what do you need in order to be able to do that well? You need to really, really understand your culture and you need to have excellent communication in place. So you can't figure out whether you need to go fast or slow unless you understand your people, and they will not tolerate all this uncertainty unless you are communicating with them. So if we're going to move, we're going to build on these kind of step-by-step approaches by starting to think of more nuances like this, then what tools would help us with that? So the first tool, and this is one that is bread and butter for me, I use this loads with loads of different clients, is looking at how culture is shaped. So this is a slightly simplified version, but very aligned with Edgar Schein's work. So if you are a bit of a geek and you want to learn about culture, Edgar Schein is often referred to as the godfather of culture. And the presumption of this model is that culture is how messages are moved around an organization. and that they move around the organization through behaviors, through symbols and rituals, and through systems and processes. So the basic premise is when we introduce a system into an organization, that is sending a message which is shaping the culture. And by looking at culture through that lens, you can get super specific about how you are communicating different messages. So, for example, we ran culture mapping workshops with a council a couple of weeks ago. They want to build a culture where people are innovative and making decisions quickly. But in terms of symbols and systems, it's actually really difficult to even just purchase a mobile phone because of the amount of processes that you have to go through. So can you see how that contradictory message of we want you to behave like this, but actually our systems and processes are driving behavior like this? Now, being able to look at that with a critical eye and use that to make your assessments on where you are on those pendulums of, okay, how fast are we going? How much governance do we need? Will become, I think, a very, very important skill for change leadership and for leadership in general. And, if you look at other sectors and you listen to sort of leadership podcasts, you will find a lot of very successful leaders saying the single most important thing that they do is shape the culture. So I think this is going to become more and more and more important for change leaders. And the second one, we touched on this earlier, but this is actually a really simple tool that helps you to identify some of those polarities. So where are we pushing towards a change and where are we pushing against the change? And that will help you to navigate where are we on that pendulum? Because I think it's important to be able to articulate, okay, we have these opposing forces. How do we navigate them? And I would do this as quite a practical exercise. You can do it very visually, where your size of your arrows represents how strong that force is, but really starting to unpick some of those tensions will help you to be in a much better place to decide which of the models you may want to use at any given point. So tips for future change, and I'm nearly there now. I've only got a couple of slides left, and then we'll open it up because I feel like this is a monologue. This is way out of my comfort zone. I'm used to these being much more chatty. So first of all, know your culture. If we're going to move away from predicting change and to a place where you're going to get skilled at being able to figure out how and which models you need to use at any given time, knowing your culture is the answer to that. And that methodology of considering culture as a system of messages enables you to get very specific, because a lot of people struggle with culture because they think it's some magic fairy dust in the air that they can't control or influence. And that is not the case. So learn how to read culture and learn how to shape it. And I think you'll be in a much stronger position to lead change well. Secondly, design and tailor your approach. So the models are good and they're useful and we still use them. I don't want to say that any of the models are rubbish. And actually that research that says this is what they've got in common and where it's backed by evidence, they're not rubbish at all. But if you become fixated on one of them and you keep trying to implement that over and over again without understanding your culture and without understanding the context that you're in, you will struggle, and you may well find that what works very well in one change program works very badly in another. The good thing about consultants is because we experience lots of different organizations, we see that lazy consultants will then try and drop the same model in everywhere they go. It's important you don't do that, because it's in the reading of the nuance and the situation where the change will really land and stick. So design and tailor your approach. Be critical about what models you're using and think carefully about what you use and when. Resource the change. So I know this is easier said than done, but there's different aspects of resourcing change. So the first thing I want to say is that skill of change is a skill in its own right. And in my opinion, we have trained managers in the art of stability. So if you think back, if you've done any management development, it often is focused on management of resources, dealing with people, creating consistency, creating stability. It's about making sure that you get results and the most bang for your buck. And all that is really important. But when you are leading change, it's about instability, uncertainty. It's not about consistency. So there is a completely different mindset there. So I think we need to get better at skilling people up, which is number 4, skilling leaders up so that they understand change, so that they can do it themselves. But also, if you are going through a change program, you need to be quite honest with yourself about how much work that is and who has those skills. So there's different ways of doing that. You know, there's interim management, there's consultancy, there's backfilling people so that they can get involved in the change. But it is nearly always more work than people think. And I'm sure many of you on the call have been involved in change programs where once you've got it up and running, you're like, oh my God, there's so much work to do. So resource it and skill up leaders. And I think there is a saying that I love, which is, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So don't be that person. So have a look at different models and different options and accept that none of them are perfect, and play with them and play with your own ideas. You know, if you approach change, we've all worked with somebody that is like a literal walking Prince 2 manual, and it doesn't land. We have to be able to tailor our approach to different circumstances, different times, different people, different change programs, and in some cases, different organizations. So tailor your approach, think about your polarities, think about the complexity, and pick and choose your models. Don't just use the same one all the time. In terms of our ingredients for good change, so this came out of the research, and the book is founded around these. There's a chapter on each of these. And when we had to do a lot of change during COVID, these were the ingredients that kept coming up over and over again. So this is less a process and more just, do we have these ingredients? So having that sense of purpose, that was massive during the pandemic. Keep people safe was a highly emotive, meaningful sense of purpose. Clarity. So, you know, again, one of the interesting things about the pandemic is that a lot of the change that happened was not new change. We'd all been talking about remote working for years. We'd all been talking about being more flexible for years. We'd all been talking about we needed to have better relationships with community groups for years. But the clarity between let's work more agilely and we're all working from home on Monday, the clarity difference in those two statements is wild. So being super clear and specific on what needs to be different is a really key ingredient. Humanity. So we focused heavily on people. We made sure that people were okay. We acknowledged that it was an emotional, difficult time. We became more human in our approach. Collaboration. There was a massive spike in partnership working, in people, you know, kind of having to work with others without barriers in the way, which was really positive in getting change to happen. Action. We focused on action because we didn't have time to plan. Everything was urgent, so we had to take action. And I think there is a really decent chapter in the book. Maybe not. Let's see when I've edited it again. But it's a hefty chapter in the book about how do you create a culture which is about taking action. And this did come through in some of the earlier change models about experimentation and making sure that you're able to get quick wins. And finally, perseverance, which comes through in the earlier change management models as well. We didn't really have a choice but to persevere during the pandemic. And a lot of that, making sure that we see it through, is really, really powerful. This is an often quote, that evolution is survival of the fittest. It is not. It is survival of the adaptable. So being able to do change well, I think, is going to become an absolutely core skill for leaders going forward in all sectors, not just local government and the public sector. The world is moving fast. Technology is moving fast. And we have to be able to adapt to different emergencies, different need, different requirements. So this is something that I do think will become core in terms of our skills as leaders. And finally, just in terms of what's next for me. So as I've said, I'm working on the book. I'm going to continue the research in whether change management as a discipline is changing. And I'm going to do a PhD next year on that. And I'm also going to run an event in spring, either April or May, which will be for people predominantly in local government, but it's open to any sector, who want to learn about some potential models and ways of doing change that are less focused on that kind of engineering and consultancy discipline, and more looking from different perspectives. So just looking for a venue for that at the moment. But I want to continue this research because I feel quite strongly that we might be doing change wrong. There is some good stuff in there. There is some good evidence-based stuff in there, but I think there's some underlying assumptions that we might need to revisit. And yeah, please do keep in touch and ask questions. Over to you, Michael. Have we got any in yet?
Yeah, Viv, thank you, has just sent a question over. Can you give some examples of the drivers versus resistance and how people can approach and work through the resistance areas? What works from your experience?
So people resist change for a variety of reasons. So some of it can be, sort of empire buildery. That is quite common. That is about making sure that you've got your facts right and making sure that you're doing the right thing. But sometimes people do resist change because they don't feel heard or because they're not heard. Or maybe because you've not painted the picture well enough. So there is an example from really early on in my career where I worked for a traded service in a council, and we ran outdoor education centres, and they were out in the sticks, very much kind of working on a shoestring. They didn't have a lot of funding, and I was the sort of business improvement manager, if you will. And I went in, and they had this very old-fashioned approach to invoicing. So I made them a spreadsheet. This was like 20 odd years ago. Made them a spreadsheet which would automate some of the process, track some of it, make sure it was much easier for them. And they were lovely. They didn't resist at all. They were very grateful. And I went back a few weeks later, and they still had all of their paper invoices up on shelves. And I asked them, why have you still got all your paper invoices? And they said, oh, don't worry, Lucy, we use your spreadsheet as well. And it always stayed with me because I've seen a repetition of that story over and over again in much higher stakes, where councils have spent millions on IT, where because I hadn't taken them through that journey properly. I hadn't done the endings bit. I hadn't done this is why it's better. This is why it's good. So in effect, when I was trying to halve their workload, I doubled it. So it always stays with me that they didn't deliberately resist. They actually did everything I asked. But in terms of the outcomes of that project, I made things worse, not better, because I didn't do that work with them to get them on side and make sure that they understood why we were doing it. So I think that is step one, make sure that people understand why. There can then be all sorts of reasons. There can be the empire building, which has got to come down to facts and numbers and leadership. There can be, there are differences. I can't remember what the model is called now, because I always refer to it as cats and cheese. And it's on the tip of my tongue. But there is a particular psychology model which is that there's individual differences in terms of our response to risk versus reward. I remember it's cats and cheese because they did the experiments on mice. So they looked at whether or not mice were sensitive to the smell of cats or cheese, cats obviously being risk and cheese being reward. So there are some people who naturally will be more sensitive to risk and therefore may resist on a risk basis. And there are some people that are more sensitive to reward that may resist on a reward basis. So if you're reducing the reward of a task, then they would resist it. So there are some motivational differences in people. But I think it does come down to really working with them and understanding why they are resisting, because there are plenty of times when people will resist because something isn't a good idea and that we might not have understood the impact of it on the front line properly. So it's a case of engaging with them and understanding it, I think, is the best tip. Don't be scared of it. Sometimes, and this is what's dangerous about some of those models that assume that resistance will always exist, is it almost discourages you from engaging with that resistance. Your biggest enemy in change is not resistance, it's just apathy. The people that are resisting care. So understand why that is and turn those people around, and that will make the change program go much smoother.
Thank you. We've had another question from Sarah. So, any tips for embedding change and realizing benefits when you're on a project with a hard end date soon after the project goal is live?
So in terms of benefits, so the question I come back to all the time with change is what will be different. So if your benefits are aligned with what will be different, then it should be easier for you to identify and measure what will be different. I think that it's a deceptively simple question that people often really struggle to answer. So that would be my starting point of what will be different as a result of this project, so that you can make sure that you really understand that and that you are realizing that difference. In terms of making sure that that continues, if your project end date is soon after, and that means that your resource, so I'm guessing that you may be from like a centralized resource, that your resource is then removed from that project and given to somewhere else. I think go back to those champions and make sure that the service owns those changes, because the other risk of resourcing it either externally or with a centralized team is that the business doesn't own it. The answer to that perseverance, to that stickability, is that the people that remain in the service own it and care about it and continue to measure and monitor it. So I'd make sure you're clear on what will be different so you can measure and monitor that. But I would also make sure that you've got that network of champions or leaders or whoever it is in place, so that it's not your project, it's theirs, if that makes sense.
Great. If anybody else has any further questions, just got a message coming. Oh, it's just a thank you from Sarah. So yeah, if anybody else has any further questions, please feel free to add. Is it, Lucy, I was just wondering, is it worth just giving some information about how we can help? I know you touched on the change readiness documentation, but what we can do.
Yeah, we do have, so there is a change readiness, which I don't know if you can quickly grab the link to that, Michael, and put it in the chat. We do have a change readiness report on our website, which asks a few questions, and then it's free to use, and you will get a tailored report. And that is based on those these components. So it will ask you questions, and I think it's only 12 or something. It's not very much. So that will definitely help you get a sense of where your change readiness is. We can also help with a lot of the stuff around culture and just really looking at your approach to change. Because what I am saying is a lot of local authorities are taking this opportunity post-COVID to have a think about how they resource change, how they run change, how their PMOs work, how their project management system works. That's something that we can certainly help with. I have just seen a really good question come in around change fatigue. So change fatigue is something I'd really like to study in a lot more detail. So everything I'm about to say is with the caveat that I'm a general change person. I haven't really got to the bottom of change fatigue. I have a theory, though, that change fatigue isn't real, and that it is fatigue of change being done badly rather than fatigue of change itself. So what we do know is everything I've just said about risk and reward, all of that is amplified during times of uncertainty. So that can create more anxiety. So that I think can be real. Also, I think that people are motivated by certain things, and some people do well in a stable environment. But equally, there is research to say some people do really well in a changing environment. So is fatigue because of there being so much change? I know I made the flippant example earlier of if you won the lottery, nobody would be talking about your resistance or your change fatigue, even though it's a massive change to your life. Or do we have fatigue because change is not digestible, it's too chaotic, it's too messy? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And it is something I would really like to do some studying on, and maybe do some research on, because it feels, and maybe I have a bias because I'm obviously one of those people that loves working in a changing environment because I've built my career around it. But I think the natural assumption that a lot of change tires people out, I think there might be some assumptions in that to challenge. If you are in that situation, though, where people are talking about change fatigue, and I'm not saying that their experience isn't real, that they will be experiencing fatigue, but I think the challenge is to look at how you're doing the change rather than you can't take your foot off the gas of the change, because as I said earlier, the environment we are in, the society that we are in, requires a phenomenal amount of change at the moment, and requires us to get really good at it. So the question is, how do we do change in a way that doesn't exhaust people? It isn't, how do we stop doing change? So how do we do it in a way that stops exhausting people? I think it's coming back to that sense of purpose. I think inadvertently, some of the approaches we use where we obsess over this sequence and the predictability of it becomes exhausting, because people get lost in that process and they're not necessarily seeing the action. So, you know, we were with a council only last week where there is this sense that there has been this massive change program going on for 6 months and nobody's seen any benefit or outcome of it yet. So sometimes when that instinct is to slow down because of fatigue, actually what your workforce needs is you to speed up. So they need to take action and to see the changes happening, rather than spending a good 6 months planning and talking about change whilst the uncertainty of, yeah, but we don't know what's going to happen, is hanging over. Just do stuff, just take action. And think about whether the change is too chaotic. So ask yourself that question: what will be different from multiple perspectives? And if the answer is there's like 35 things going to be different for one staff member, is there a way of consolidating that or making that make more sense? So yeah, that was a long answer, but it is something I'm genuinely quite interested in.
Great stuff. Thank you. I've also, just while you're answering that, I've put the link into the change readiness assessment. And I've also just put a link in because Lucy did a video on our website in regards to the cats and cheese model that she was talking about before, well, the theory before. So I've also just put a link in for that if people would like to have a little bit more look into that. We have had another question from Rebecca. So how do you manage a conversation with a manager who is very suspicious about change management being the fluffy stuff, if you're coming in saying that you can't give them a simple answer or solution?
So I wouldn't talk to them about change management is the first thing. I would talk to them about what change they're trying to make happen, and I would focus it on that. So not everybody's interested in this, and that's okay. Sometimes, I mean, change management has been guilty of being the fluffy stuff. It really has. And particularly in the way that it's been partnered with project management, it's quite easy to look at project management as the real stuff and then change management as the fluffy stuff. But I wouldn't be having that debate with somebody at all. What I would be doing is I would be talking to them about, okay, so what is going to be different for your people? And then I'd be talking about practical ways in which you can help make that difference. So if one of the differences is they'll be working in a different location, I would then go straight into, okay, so do we need to do a consultation process about that? Do we need to, you know, what are they going to be worried about? They're going to be worried about parking. Are they going to be worried? So I would just leave the academics behind and center yourself into that change, and the what will be different is a really, really good way of doing that, because then that manager is going to feel that you're helping them practically rather than talking to them about models. Some people are not going to be interested in it, and that really is okay. I mean, longer term, I think we need our leaders to be much more skilled in change, but whether we call that change management or leadership doesn't really matter. When we can, and again, this is another area that the world of academia is guilty of, getting lost in categorizing things, when in actual fact it's more about meeting that person where they are and helping them to make that change happen on a practical basis. That is probably how I would approach that. I wouldn't try and change the mind about change management. I'd probably make a joke of it and just not talk about it in those terms.
Great, thank you. A couple of minutes left. So Lucy, I'm going to finish with how I usually finish, and it's a difficult one, this one, because I know it's a topic that you're very passionate about, obviously. If there's one main takeaway for people from today, what would it be?
Think critically about models. So I'm not saying don't use them, and I do use them, and I do train people in them, but always with the caveat, think critically about them. No, there's not a single model out there that was designed perfectly for your change, for your organization at this particular point in time. So be critical and be selective, and marry it up with your culture. That would be my tip. Don't go away, read a book, and then keep trying to replicate that book over and over again. Read a load of books. Pick and choose.
Great. Well, thank you. There's anything else you want to add, Lucy? There's nothing else from me, and no other questions in the chat.
I don't think so. We've got 2 more events booked. Have you got the link to those, Mike?
Yeah. I have. So yeah, just I just want to say thank you again for Lucy for today, and thank you for everyone for joining. So yeah, we have got 2 more change chats coming on the 8th of November. We have culture change, and on the 6th of December we have improving services and service reviews. So I've just put the links in the chat to them. So I just want to finally add, if you've enjoyed today, we have several more change chats also available on our website. And also on topics such as comms and engagement, housing, household support fund, and also we have lots of other material on our website as well, which would be really, which is helpful. So for next steps, as I mentioned at the start, you'll all receive an email which will have a copy of the recording of today's session. And finally, just want to say thank you very much again for everyone for coming. If you have any queries about anything you've heard today or anything change related or Trueman change related, please get in touch and that can be arranged. I mean, some really nice comments coming in the chat. So thank you again, and thank you, Lucy. So
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us, and do feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to geek out with anybody that wants to talk about change. And yeah, hope to see you at future events.